Hello, welcome to Knitting Matters. This is season 3, episode 9. Really nice to have you here, whether you're watching this live or the replay later. Thank you so much for joining. I'm Cheryl Lampard. I'm an image consultant. I'm a fibre artist. I'm a knitting educator. I'm a CYC, Craft Yarn Council certified knitting instructor. And I used to be a yarn store owner in Brighton, England, and one of the great joys of owning a yarn store is that I got to teach people how to knit. And I'm doing that now, all these years later, and the wonderful medium of social media means I can reach more people, so that's wonderful. Now, I love teaching then, and I love it just as much now. So today, it's all about the questions that you have asked. I picked out a selection that I thought would be interesting. So I'm going to ask the camera to move to the worktop and we'll get started. So the first question was from Alyssa from Michigan. And she says that she sees WPIs mentioned. She actually thought it was a typo at first for WIP, work in progress. So she was asking, what is a WPI? Well, the answer is it means wraps per inch. Now, way back in season 1, episode 17, I talked a bit about them. And it's such a great question, Alyssa, that I thought it was worth revisiting, especially if you're new to Knitting Matters and you haven't seen what wraps per inch are. Now, it's a term that is well known to spinners and weavers. And since there are no ball bands on hand-spun yarn, it's a way of determining the thickness of yarn. But it's just as useful for us knitters and crocheters because sometimes we come across yarn without a label or in our stash the ball band has been lost. So we can use it as a guide, and I say guide, it's not an exact science, to find the thickness of yarn and the weight in terms of category for needles, gauge, etc. So what do we need for wraps per inch? Well, there aren't specific tools that you can buy. And I should have asked if you can hear me okay. I forgot to ask that. I'm going to keep going, assuming that you can until somebody tells me otherwise. So, there are various tools to find wraps per inch. This is my little sheepy tool. I'll show you how to use it in a second. I do know that spinners and weavers use something that this isn't one, but it's more shaped like this. This is actually just a wooden shawl pin, but there is a gadget that has a longer end here with a notch in where you put the yarn end in, and then you would wrap. It's also this part, the shaft is thicker, and then you would wrap the yarn round and count per. It has measured markings on it. So that's something that you can buy. But as I say, this is just my shawl pin. Oh, Linda, thank you. You said the sound is good. I appreciate that. Okay, so, but if you don't have any tools, that's just fine. You can use it do it just as easily with a pencil and a ruler or just a ruler. So what I've done here is you wrap the yarn in inches. So you can't really see on this ruler because it's black against black, but you might just be able to see there against my hand. I've wrapped an inch worth of yarn of various weights. And when you wrap, it doesn't have, you don't want it to be tight. You want it to be snug, but not tight. You must make sure that the wraps lay side by side. Ah, thank you. Yes. So there you can see my inches. So you want to make sure that the wraps lie side by side, that they're not overlapping. And again, you don't pull them too tightly, otherwise it'll stretch them out and give you a false reading, as it were. So it doesn't really matter the width of the tool, it's the wraps, how many wraps to the inch that make the difference. So let's see how accurate we are. Once you've wrapped your yarn, you want to download a chart. There's plenty of them. The chart that I have here is actually from the Craft Yarn Council. You can get that online very easily, but there are others. So this tells you, gives you a guide on wraps per inch, as does this. Now I'm going to come back to that in a moment, but I want to see how I've done here. Because compared to this one, because you'll see there's slight differences here. Now, I happen to know that for this purple silk, I've got 18 wraps for my inch there. Now, according to this little tool, lace is 16 to 18. Well, I know that's a little thicker than lace, but on this chart from the Craft Yarn Council, 18 wraps, it's fine. It's a fine weight, which that is really. This is a fine weight. It's not quite lace. That would be finer still. But it's in the ballpark. On this one, which is a sort of a DK, a worsted DK, this one I have 12 wraps to the inch. On the Craft Yarn Council chart, 12 wraps, I'm going to be between 12 and 18. Yeah, it's more up here. It's weight 3, although I do know that this is actually, yeah, it could be any of these, but I know that this is a weight 4. It's a medium weight. So I'm right on there with my 12 wraps. On my little sheep tool here, it says DKs 11, Sport 12. Again, it's within that ballpark. Lastly, my pale pink yarn. This is a super bulky yarn. I know that I've got 6 wraps here. And what do we say here? Super bulky on my sheep tool is 5 to 6 wraps. And super bulky, yeah, these two agree. But let me just show you how we would do this. And I'll use the thickest one first so you know. And let's see how this one comes out. Again, I said it's not an exact science. It's a guide. So I would just wrap. It's actually easier on this little tool because it grips a bit better at the top. On my ruler, it was a little slippery. So I wrap 4, 5, 6. Yeah, that's about right. And, you know, you then choose whatever you come up with. And there are variables. It's not written in stone. The variables include the yarn content, whether it's a synthetic or a natural fibre, how tightly the yarn is spun, whether it's got bobbles or noops in it. So for that reason alone, some knitters and some authors of knitting books don't like wraps per inch. But I think it's useful to know how to do it in case you do come across those yarns in your stash that you don't have the ball band for. It's just another check as well. Okay, so that's wraps per inch, and thank you again for that question. Okay, right, next thing we're going on to is needle sizes. Melissa, and I'm not sure where Melissa is from. Melissa asked a question about needle sizes, specifically metric versus US. Which is best? Well, let's just explain a few things first. US needle sizing goes in numbers. The smaller the number, the smaller the diameter of the needle. Okay? Metric sizing is based on measurements too. It's based on the diameter of the needle. So a metric 4mm needle measures 4mm diameter. It's that simple. Whereas kind of US sizing is arbitrary. What does a 6 mean? It doesn't bear relation to the millimeter sizing, but that's okay. So US needles actually now put both sizes, both US sizing and metric on. This has both, it's upside down, but it's harder to see, but US 6, 4mm. This one was obviously a needle from the UK because it doesn't have another size on it. It just goes straight into millimeters. Now, I like metric. My preference is for metric. And the reason is, A, because of it's obvious what it is. If it's a measurement of diameter, 4mm is 4mm. That's it. You don't have to guess. But there are metric size needles for which there is no equivalent in US sizing. And I'm going to show you this little chart. Again, I pulled this off from the Craft Yarn Council. And I have this other gizmo here, which gives me sizing for crochet hooks and needle sizing too. But let's just look at this for a moment. It's easier to look at this one. So this is all fine until we get down to, there was an error here, they printed something twice. So there's a 3mm, there's no exact size for a US size range there, except I know on this little guy here, there is a size for a 3, okay? But then we go further down and we've got a 4mm and a 4¼ a 4.25. They both say they're a size 6 in US sizing. How can that be? Now you might think, well, 1/4 mm, it's not very much, but it might actually be quite a lot across the size of a sweater, or your gauge could be really quite off. And again, we travel down further here, we've got the same problem again. We've got a 5¼ mm and a 5½ mm, both a size 9. Well, how can that be? And then we've got some sizing there that doesn't really compute. Again, for a 7mm, there's not really an equivalent size in the US range. And so on and so on. So, metric, you can actually use the needles more usefully, because if you do have to go up and down for sizing, you've got more to choose from. Sometimes a half size of a needle or a full size of a needle is actually, in US sizing, is too much. You know, your gauge isn't still not quite there. But with metric, you've actually got more needles to choose from. So for those two reasons alone, I do prefer the metric system, because it's a measurement. I can visualize what the size is. And if I have to alter my gauge, I've got more needle sizes to choose from. Now that said, as a Brit, I do remember before the UK went metric in 1965, that their needle sizes also were numbered. And rather confusingly, in old UK sizing, the larger the number, the smaller the size. Yeah, I always thought it odd that a size 14 needle was just 2mm in metric system and a US size 0. So that is, yeah, fortunately, as I say and showed you this needle, which is just, this is a UK needle, it just says 5mm. Doesn't put old UK sizing on anymore. Now, I'd love to know what Canada uses. I believe it's UK imperial sizing too, or the same sort of sizing as the old UK system. I could well be wrong, and I would love to know. If anyone knows about Canadian needle sizes, I'd love to know what you use. Now, one thing I would say, be aware if you're knitting vintage patterns and they're coming from the UK, or you've inherited a bunch of needles with only a number on them. If that is the case, I would strongly suggest that you use a little gizmo, a chart like this, a guide like this, where you poke the needle through and, you know, you can check the sizing. I would strongly recommend that you do that. That's crochet hooks, that size. Oh, that's odd. Lots of numbers and lots of sizes. Okay, but you want to use something like this so you can check your sizing. And then I would suggest that you mark the needles. They'll still be good as needles. You just need to know what sizes you're using. Okay? Because I'd hate you to start knitting a pattern for a vintage sweater and then find you're using the wrong needles. It does happen. Okay. Something else we're going to talk about. I did originally cover this in season 2, episode 31, but for some reason there was a glitch and the replay was never uploaded to YouTube. So I figured it was worth revisiting this because it's such a good question. The viewer's question was about Gage for knitting in the round. Why did hers come out different to flat knitting, even when she did test swatches? Well, the reason for that is that a stockinette stitch worked flat. You're working both sides of the fabric. You're using knit stitches and purl stitches for the other side. When you're knitting in the round, you're only making knit stitches. You're going all the way round with just knit stitches. Now, the wrong side, when you knit in the round, your wrong side, if you're just using knit stitches, it looks like reverse stockinette stitch, but it's actually not, because you've only knit in the round. You're only using knit stitches. And most knitters' tension is different when they're purling. Mine is. It's usually a little bit looser. So a flat stockinette stitch swatch won't give an accurate representation of fabric worked in the round. You need to make a swatch using only knit rows. Now, you can certainly do this by working a decent sized swatch in the round, but you know that can be a bit of a faff. An easier and an effective method is this one. For this demo, I'm going to just use about a couple of inches of stitches that I've cast on. For a proper sample, I'd need to have a sample that would be at least 5 to 6 inches across. And you need either a circular needle, it doesn't really matter what size because you're not joining, or DPNs. I'm using 2 DPNs because I just happen to have them handy. As I say, I'm using fewer stitches than I would for a full sample, and that's for speed because I want to show you what I'm going to do. Okay, so I've done a few rows here, and what I've done is I've knitted the first stitch through the back of the loop. Okay, so I'm going to bring my yarn forward. I'm going to bring my yarn round. You'll see what these loops are for in a minute. So I'm going to I'm going to bring my yarn round and I'm going to wrap it over my hand. I want to get large loops. So I'm knitting through the back of that stitch. Then I'm going to knit all the way to the end. That's the reason I only did a few stitches here, because you don't need to see me knitting across 5 or 6 inches of fabric. So when I get to the end, and you could actually do a couple of stitches at the start through the back loops and a couple at the end. I've just done one at each end. Okay, so that's a row that I've just done, and I've left my loops nice and big. Now what I do is slide that up to the other end of the needle again. Put my hand in my loops. If you can find a better way of making sure you get nice big loops, knock yourself out, do it the way that you choose to, but you want to make these loops nice and big because you're going to cut them, and then you would start again. So I've got my knitting through the back of the loops, knitting, 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 and so on. I won't do the whole thing, but you can see what I'm doing. And then once I've done my size of swatch, all I would do is cut those, and then block my swatch. So it would end up looking like this one. Now you can measure it. This is going to give, obviously you would bind off when it's sufficient size, cut your loops, block it, and now you can measure for gauge. As I say, it does seem a lot of trouble, but it is worth it, especially if you're doing a garment where the gauge is important, because that can matter. You know, the difference, it might only seem a few stitches or a few rows in a swatch, but when you're doing it on a whole garment, it can make a lot of difference if your gauge is off. Okay, so that's how to do a gauge swatch for knitting in the round. Okay, whoops, I'm tangling myself up. Okay, question 4. Now this one often trips up new knitters. When a pattern instruction, this one isn't a specific one asked by a specific individual, but it comes up a lot, and I see it a lot in my mailbox and on social media forums. And it often trips up new knitters. When a pattern says to slip a stitch, which way do you do it? I'm just using this sample. Unless it says otherwise, you always slip it purlwise. Okay? And then you would carry on your knitting. Now, why is that? The reason is that it seats the stitch. When you slip purlwise, you seat the stitch back on the right-hand needle exactly as it's left the left-hand needle, if that makes sense. Let me unpick because I want to use that for other things in a minute. So unless your pattern says otherwise, you're going to slip purlwise. You're not changing the position of the stitch, whereas if you slip knitwise, that's seated now in a different way. We're not knitting the stitch, we're slipping it. So I hope you can see the difference. If I slip it purlwise, it's where I need it to be. And it's not going to look twisted. If I slip it that way, it's seated differently. And when I knit the rest of my fabric, it's going to look odd in the stitches. So always, always, always slip purlwise unless the pattern says otherwise. Now, I'm going to continue on this little sample. This last question, left-leaning decreases, the confusion over that, the stitches to use. This one crops up all the time, not just in my mailbox, but in all the knitting forums. I see this a lot. And the question is, SSK and K2 together, TBL, which means slip, slip, knit through the back of loops, and knit 2 together through the back of loops. Are they the same thing? It's probably easier when you watch me do it. They are both left-leaning decreases, but they're not the same, and here's why. Now, this is one instance where you do slip knitwise. So we slip, slip, one at a time. You don't do them both at the same time. If you do, you get a completely different stitch and it will go in the other direction. So I'd slip, slip. I've slipped these knitwise. And now I put them back on the left needle, or I put my left needle into the front of the stitches. I don't change the position of them. Now I can knit through the back of the loop. Okay? What if I just want to knit two together through the back of the loops? Well, I can certainly do that. And for all intents and purposes, you might think they look the same. But I'm going to show you what I've done earlier on, and you'll see that they're really not. I'm just going to unpick that because I need to use one of those stitches. And I want to make sure those are seated properly on my needle. Sorry, I'm looking around the iPad to see what I'm doing. So I'm going to do a slip, slip, knit through the back of the loops. Then I'm going to just knit 2 stitches. Now I'm going to do knit 2 through the back of loops. Let me knit to the end of the row because I want you to see the difference in what I did earlier so you could see. And I see on Facebook a lot of people saying, well, I don't do SSK. It seems a lot of faff. Don't need to do it. I just do knit through the back of the loops. But here's the difference. This side is all knitted as SSK. This side is knitted through the back of the loops. And you can see this is much smoother. There's still left-leaning decreases. You just decrease 1 stitch at a time. It's a left-leaning decrease. It's much smoother. It's much neater. Whereas this is a bit clunkier. And the reason for that is because the stitch has twisted. It's hard to see, but this is exactly the position it should be in. It's come off the needle, seated in the position that it should be in. Here, it's twisted right at the base. You can see it's twisted. And that's what gives you that kind of step look. Now, you may like that. You may want that. You may like that. And if you do, that's great. But when you hear or see somebody saying that SSK and knit 2 together through the back loops are the same thing, they're not. They're interchangeable in that you can use either if you wish to, because they're going to lean in the direction that you want, but they are not the same stitch at all. So I will ask the camera to come back to me. I hope you found those visits to things that we've done before perhaps, but in a different way, and new things today. I hope you found them useful. I really love to have your questions. It makes everybody a better knitter, because if you want to ask the question, somebody else wants to as well. So never hesitate in asking a question. You can put it on the Knitter Matters Facebook page, or you can direct message me, and I'll be happy to include them in a future episode. So as always, this episode and others are uploaded to Facebook and to our YouTube channel, Knitter Matters YouTube channel, and you can see all previous episodes on the YouTube channel. I do recommend that you subscribe to it, and that way you'll get any new episodes that are published straight into your feed. If you want a playlist for the whole series 1, 2, and ultimately 3, which I'm still working on, obviously, then just let me know and I'll send you those so you can see the content of each episode. This, if you're looking for this later, is season 3, episode 9, and I hope you enjoyed it. I look forward to seeing you next time, and in the meantime, keep well, keep calm, and keep knitting. Bye for now.